The moment Mira spoke those words, the air inside Veil International stood still, just like Corwin Veil's heart. Welcome, beautiful souls, new and returning. If you've ever loved deeply, lost suddenly, or questioned what might have been, this story is for you. Today's journey will take you through a hidden love, a buried truth, and the kind of reunion that changes everything. May the hearts watching find healing in truth, strength in forgiveness, and the courage to face what was left behind. Don't forget to subscribe. Stories like this are too powerful to miss. Elmsworth shimmered under winter's gold sun. Glass towers reached toward the sky like frozen monuments to ambition. There, reflections dancing on polished black cars and silent marble streets. From above, the city sparkled, but down below, beneath the surface sheen, it felt strangely quiet, like a kingdom ruled by a man who'd mastered the art of control but forgotten the warmth of connection. Corwin Veil stood alone in his corner office on the 78th floor of Veil International's headquarters. To the outside world, he was the architect of an empire, the man who could bend industry forecasts. With a gesture whose eyes held the cold clarity of someone who had nothing left to prove. But power, when left to grow without purpose, starts to echo back on itself. He didn't speak often. He didn't smile unless required. No one dared to ask why he never married, why his penthouse lights never stayed on past 10, or why no photograph, not one, decorated his desk. His office was sterile by choice. The walls bore no degrees, no family nameplates, no frames from company milestones. Only a single item was out of place, a small, hand-carved box that sat just behind his keyboard. He never opened it during the day, never spoke of it. But every morning before the building stirred, he'd sit alone, unlock it with a brass key, and stare at its contents in silence. Inside, a silver pendant with faded engravings, and a letter, unfolded, unfinished, unsent. No one knew the name etched on the note, but he did. Ilara. That name was both a memory and a wound. Once, many years ago, Corwin Veil wasn't a fortress. He laughed freely. He moved with grace instead of calculation. He studied art in hidden corners of the city and memorized the way light curved across canvas. He loved a woman who painted emotions into colors he could never name. Ilara Dune. She had fire in her voice and stillness in her eyes. A contradiction he could never understand and never wanted to fix. She challenged him. She softened him. With her, he wasn't a CEO in training. He was simply Corwin, the man who would skip meetings just to watch her paint in silence. She would hum while she worked. He would sketch her outline in notebooks he never let anyone see. And then, one day, she was gone. No warning, no goodbye, no trace. He searched every gallery, every street, every backroom cafe where they'd once laughed over wine and whispered about dreams. But her name had vanished from leases, her phone disconnected, her studio emptied. It was as if she had never existed, except he knew better. His memories of her were too vivid to be fiction. Weeks passed, then months, then years. Business filled the silence. He told himself she had moved on, that she was never his to keep. But part of him never stopped asking why. Now, 15 years later, standing in a high-rise worth billions, Corwin Veil still felt colder at the height of his success than he ever had in failure. The world saw him as flawless. He felt fractured. The silver pendant in the box, hers, left behind in his coat pocket on the last day he saw her. The letter, his, started after her disappearance, never finished. Words failed him then. They still did now. His empire was complete, but the man behind it wasn't. Have you ever buried love just to survive? Comment below. Your story matters here. Some men build walls to keep the world out. Corwin Veil built his to keep a memory in. He stood now before a floor-to-ceiling window, staring at a city he had conquered. But as his reflection stared back, he wasn't looking at the empire. He was looking through it, somewhere far behind the steel and glass, to a studio that once smelled of oil paints and jasmine tea. Her voice still found him in quiet moments. You're not as cold as you pretend to be, Corwin. He had told her once, one day, I'll own this city. She had laughed. What will it cost you? Everything, it turned out. There had been a night, the last night, when she was painting in the corner of her small loft. A deep crimson sunset had spilled across the canvas as he traced her features with his eyes. She didn't speak much that evening, only glanced at him now and then, as if memorizing the shape of his silence. Something in her was different. Her smile softer, but sadder. Her fingers slower, as if unsure. He remembered asking, "What's wrong?" She had said only, "Some beauty isn't meant to last forever." And in the morning, she was gone. He had torn through the city like a storm. Canceled meetings, ignored the board, filed missing person reports that went nowhere. Some whispered she had left him. Others thought she'd gone back to her art roots abroad. But no one knew. And Corwin never told them what he feared most, that maybe deep down she had vanished because of him. Had he loved her too hard? Had the weight of his ambition scared her off? Was it his fault? These were the questions that anchored his sleepless nights. Years later, when his name was printed on the cover of every finance publication, when investors hung on his every word, when presidents of nations shook his hand with reverence, he still found himself staring at an empty chair across his penthouse table, wondering what she would have thought of it all. He imagined her mocking his oversized art collection with playful disdain. You always bought paintings instead of creating your own. Still afraid of the brush? No one challenged him anymore. No one made him laugh like she had, genuinely, breathlessly, helplessly. The women he dated afterward all seemed perfect on paper, but paper can't hold warmth. They didn't know about the hand-carved box. They never noticed his eyes flick toward the window during dinner, as if waiting for something that never came. Every now and then, he would walk the block where her old studio once stood. It had been torn down and replaced with luxury apartments, bland and soulless. But in his mind, he could still see her leaning against the doorway in paint. Stained clothes, smirking at him like he was her greatest unfinished sketch. The world admired his focus, but it was grief that taught him discipline. There was no room for chaos after she left, no margin for emotion. He honed himself into precision. He let routine replace romance. He stopped searching for what felt like home and built something no one could take from him, control. But there were days, fewer now but real, when he'd wake up with her name half-spoken on his lips. Days when the scent of jasmine or the sound of a certain melody would freeze him mid-step. He would close his eyes, and there she was. Ilara. Her name wasn't just a memory. It was a ghost with gentle hands. A breath that never quite left the room. A love that didn't end. It simply paused, somewhere between now and the moment she disappeared. He never told anyone. What could he say? That the most powerful man in Elmsworth still kept a pendant in a hidden box? That he never threw away her last teacup? That a voice from 15 years ago still lived at the edge of his every triumph? No. Some losses are too sacred for public sympathy, so he carried her in silence. Every deal, every boardroom conquest, every headline, he did it all with her absence folded neatly beneath his suit. Until one day, 3 unfamiliar faces would walk into his building, wearing smiles that looked too familiar. Eyes that held a reflection of something long buried. Words that would break open a world he thought was sealed shut. But that moment hadn't come yet. For now, Corwin Veil remained the man the world applauded, and the only man who knew that even legacies can be built on missing pieces. Selbridge wasn't a town people moved to. It was the kind of place where people simply remained. A 2-lane highway passed through it, lined with weathered signs, sleepy diners, and mailboxes with rusted hinges. The locals knew each other by first name, and everyone still waved from their porches even if they hadn't spoken in years. It was the kind of town that seemed untouched by urgency. Things arrived late in Selbridge. Springtime, mail, gossip, and sometimes the truth. Tucked at the edge of the woods, in a modest home with ivy curling around the fence, lived a woman named Leora and the 3 children she had raised with steady hands and quiet strength. They weren't children anymore, though. 21 now. Grown, but not yet hardened. Still chasing meaning in the ordinary. Triplets, yes, but each shaped by a different rhythm. Saren, the eldest by 6 minutes, carried wonder in her voice. She believed in love the way some people believed in gravity, with quiet certainty, even when no one else did. She worked part-time at the town bookstore, where she was known for rearranging the poetry shelf by mood rather than author. Kyle, second-born and tallest, was all sharp edges and folded arms. He didn't believe in stories, only facts. He fixed things, asked too many questions, and kept his emotions shelved like tools he didn't know how to use. While Saren dreamed, Kyle calculated. Mira was the youngest. She didn't speak unless she had something to say, but when she did, her words landed like truth whispered into still water. Observant to the point of discomfort, Mira often saw what others missed, the tremor behind a smile, the pause in someone's breath. She painted, mostly in secret. And then there was Leora. To them, she had always been strong in the softest ways. She didn't rush. She didn't punish. She listened more than she spoke and never raised her voice, even when she should have. She made tea when they cried, sat beside them during storms and always smiled when they asked about the past, but never truly answered. The question of their father hovered over their childhood like a cloud that never turned into rain. They had asked, of course, many times. Some stories, she would say, take time to be told, but that time never seemed to arrive. Until the day a letter did. It came on a Tuesday morning in late October. The wind was restless, carrying the scent of dry leaves and distant wood smoke. Leora was folding laundry on the porch when the postman handed her the envelope. At first she didn't react. She just stared at it. The paper was thick, trimmed in gold, stamped with an insignia none of them recognized, an intricate 5 interwoven with vines. The name on the envelope read, Ilara Dune. None of the triplets noticed the change in her face at first. Only Mira saw the way her fingers tightened, then loosened. "Mom?" she asked, slowly. "Who's Ilara?" Leora blinked. She opened her mouth, closed it. Her lips parted again, but no words came. Kyle took the letter gently from her hands and examined it. "This looks expensive." He turned it over, scanning for a sender. "Veil International." Saren frowned. "That's a company. A huge one. I think I've heard of them on the news. Something about mergers." The name meant nothing to them, but it meant everything to her. Leora stood up slowly and whispered, "I need a moment," then walked into the house with a quietness that suddenly felt unfamiliar. The silence after Leora left the porch was unlike any they had felt before. Not angry, not cold, just dense. It held weight. Mira sat still, her fingers laced together tightly in her lap. Her eyes never left the screen door, now swaying slightly from the breeze. Saren reached for the letter again, turning it slowly in her hands. "Ilara Dune," she whispered. "It sounds familiar." "Because it's close to Leora Dune," Kyle said, tapping his thumb against the wooden table. "Change a few letters, different name, same rhythm." Saren's gaze snapped up. "Are you saying that's her real name?" Kyle didn't answer immediately. He leaned back, folding his arms. "I don't know what I'm saying." But she looked like she'd seen a ghost when she read it. Mira spoke softly. She looked like someone who just got found. No one replied, but the words clung to the air. They had known their mother as kind, careful, wise, and sometimes distant. There had been moments through the years when she would drift in thought, stare too long at a particular painting, or fold clothes with tears in her eyes for no reason at all. Saren had always assumed she was simply sentimental. Kyle had assumed she was hiding something. Mira had never assumed anything. She just watched. Minutes passed. The screen door creaked open again. Leora stepped back onto the porch, her expression unreadable. She held the envelope in one hand, her fingers still pressed tightly around the edges. It was slightly bent now, not from mishandling, but from being held too long by someone unsure what to do with it. "I know you have questions," she said, her voice steady, "and you deserve answers." Saren reached for her mother's hand gently. "We just want to understand." Leora sat down slowly, as if the weight of the letter had finally made her bones ache. She looked at each of them, her eyes lingering on their faces, their features so familiar and yet so unique. So much of him in them. "I never meant to lie to you," she began. "I only wanted to protect you." Kyle's jaw clenched. "From what?" "From a life I once loved, but had to leave." Mira tilted her head, her voice barely louder than a breath. "Is Ilara Dune your real name?" Leora nodded. "Yes." None of them spoke, but the world seemed to shift slightly beneath them, like the foundation of who they thought they were had tilted an inch. Kyle stood and paced the porch, one hand raking through his hair. "So you changed your name, moved here, raised us in the middle of nowhere. Because of what?" Leora closed her eyes for a moment, breathing carefully. "Because love isn't always safe, and sometimes the past doesn't let go quietly." Saren leaned forward. "Was he dangerous?" Leora shook her head. "No, not him. But the world around him was." She looked down at the envelope again, tracing the golden trim with her fingertip. "This letter, it's from his world." Kyle stopped pacing. Whose? Leora hesitated. Your father? There it was. The moment that had always been waiting at the edges of their lives. No lightning, no explosion. Just a quiet sentence that cracked something open. Mira looked at her mother for a long time. You loved him? Leora nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. With all that I was... Saren's eyes brimmed with tears. Did he know about us? Leora hesitated, then answered with the truth she had carried like a stone in her chest. No. The porch fell into a deep hush. Kyle looked away, blinking hard. Saren covered her mouth with her hands. Mira finally stood and walked to her mother. She knelt beside her chair, placing one hand on Leora's arm. Tell us the rest, she said gently. Please. Leora sat straighter in her chair, as if bracing against a memory already rising. Before I was your mother, she said, before Selbridge, before this life, I was Ilara Dune. I lived in a city called Elmsworth, and I loved a man named Corwin Vale. She paused, letting the name settle like dust after a long silence. Mira didn't flinch. Saren exhaled softly, as if she'd always known. Kyle crossed his arms, but didn't interrupt. I met him at an exhibit, Leora continued. I was showing 3 paintings, small, quiet pieces, nothing grand. But he stopped in front of one, stood there for 10 minutes without moving. Afterward he found me and said it made him feel something he couldn't name. Her lips curved slightly, not quite into a smile. We talked until the gallery closed, and then we talked every day after that. She folded her hands in her lap. He wasn't the man you're imagining, not yet. Not the CEO with a skyline behind him. He was curious, careful with his words. He'd bring me sketchbooks filled with half-formed thoughts and ask if I thought they were worth anything. I always said yes. Her eyes drifted across the porch, to the fading treetops. We were young, but it didn't feel like youth. It felt like something older waking up, like we'd known each other before time decided to keep track. Saren reached for her hand and held it gently. So what happened? She asked. Leora looked down at their fingers. He started rising. His ideas turned into meetings, his meetings into contracts. His name began to echo in rooms I wasn't part of. I didn't mind, not at first. I knew he was building something. I believed he could change things. Kyle shifted slightly. But someone didn't want you there. Leora nodded slowly. Power invites attention, she said, and attention invites enemies. There were people, men, who saw me as a weakness, not because of who I was, but because of who I was to him. She took a long breath. One night, I came home to find a letter slipped under my door. No signature, no demands, just a warning, leave quietly or everything we dreamed of would burn. Mira's voice was soft. You were already pregnant. Leora nodded. I didn't know if it was a threat they meant to follow through, but I couldn't take the chance. I couldn't let him lose everything because of me, and I couldn't risk what was growing inside me. She looked up, her eyes now glassy but unbroken. So, I disappeared. Kyle's voice was sharper than he meant it to be. You didn't tell him? Not even once? I tried, she said, quickly. I wrote him a letter. I left it with someone I trusted, someone who promised to deliver it, but I think it never made it to him. Silence settled again. Saren whispered, So he never knew we existed? No, Leora said. Not until now. Not unless he reads that letter. Mira sat beside her. You lived with that pain all these years? Leora closed her eyes. It wasn't the pain I minded. It was the wondering. If he hated me. If he thought I stopped loving him. Cale finally spoke, his voice lower now. Did you? She looked at him, really looked, and answered without pause. Not for a single day. The wind stirred the leaves. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang twice. Saren wiped her eyes and asked, So what happens now? Leora stared at the letter in her lap. The seal was still unbroken. I hadn't decided, she admitted, but I think the letter arriving means the story isn't done. Kyle stepped off the porch and looked down the road. If he's still out there, he deserves to know the truth. He does, Mira said, and we deserve to meet the part of ourselves we never knew. Leora turned to them, her voice almost a whisper. You would go to Elmsworth? Yes, Saren said immediately. I would, Mira said softly. Kyle looked at them both, then back at his mother. If you won't go, he said, we will. Before Corwin Vale became a name people respected from a distance, he was just a man who walked through the quiet rooms of local galleries in search of color that could move him. That's where he met her. Ilara was standing in front of her own painting when he arrived late to the opening. She wasn't dressed for attention, no bright red, no exaggerated effort. Just a loose ivory blouse, paint under one fingernail, and a gaze that looked straight through pretense. He paused before her canvas, a field, sunlit, but with shadows curled gently in the corners. She didn't say a word. Neither did he. When he finally spoke, it wasn't praise. It was curiosity. Why the shadows? She smiled. Because even beauty needs somewhere to rest. That was the beginning. Their courtship wasn't loud. It grew in late dinners and long walks, in glances that held more than full conversations. He started bringing her notebooks filled with ideas, scribbled thoughts for a business. That didn't exist yet, visions that sounded absurd to everyone but her. She never laughed. She encouraged him, softly, without pressure, as if she could already see what the world would one day admire. He often said she made the future feel less like a task and more like a painting waiting to be filled in. He rented a small studio for her near the edge of Elmsworth, just a few blocks from the river. He'd stop by after long meetings, loosen his tie, and watch her paint with his shoes off and his heart wide open. "Stay still," she'd whisper. "You're in this one." At night they'd share tea on the fire escape, counting the lights of the city, and wondering which ones would remember their names when they were gone. He told her about his fears, about how power wasn't just something you reached for, but something that changed you when you held it too long. She told him love could be stronger than that, if he let it. Their connection wasn't perfect, but it was deep. It was quiet and anchoring, like a song only they could hear. It moved them both without noise. For 2 years, they loved without boundaries, and then things shifted. Not between them, but around them. Corwin's name had started rising. The foundation of Veil International was forming beneath his feet, and with it came attention. He noticed unfamiliar cars parked outside their apartment building for too long. Strangers began asking about her paintings, not for purchase, but for details, where she painted, when she worked, how long she stayed out. He dismissed it at first, said they were overthinking, until one night they returned home to find the door slightly ajar. Nothing was taken, but her canvas, an unfinished one she'd been working on for weeks, had a single slash across it, straight down the middle. That was the night she knew things had changed. She didn't speak much afterward, but he saw the worry tightening her shoulders. The softness in her eyes grew cautious. She started locking every door twice. Still, she stayed. For a while, the cut canvas wasn't a warning, it was a message. Ilara said nothing the night they found it. She simply cleaned up the edges, wrapped the ruined piece in cloth, and placed it gently in the corner. Corwin offered to call the authorities, hire security, relocate, anything to make her feel safe again. But Ilara knew what he didn't. This wasn't about theft or jealousy. It was pressure, not from strangers in alleyways, but from boardroom whispers, quiet partnerships, and powerful people who didn't like risk. And to them, she was risk, an artist, a free spirit. A woman with no pedigree and too much access to the man they were grooming. She overheard things, accidentally, always. Her name spoken behind doors, usually followed by the word liability. Investors were growing impatient. She noticed changes in Corwin's calendar, in the silence after meetings, in the looks he began receiving from men in tailored suits. One afternoon, while alone in the studio, she received a call. No greeting, no name, just a voice. "If you care about him, you'll leave." Quietly, she hung up, but the shaking didn't stop. Later that week, a plain envelope appeared beneath her door. Inside was a newspaper clipping, a staged image of Corwin at an event, smiling beside unfamiliar faces. Scrawled across the photo in ink, "He doesn't need weakness. Don't ruin what he's building." Ilara said nothing. She just folded the envelope and tucked it away. She had always believed love could weather anything. But this wasn't about storms between them. It was about forces that didn't play fair. She didn't tell Corwin about the letter, or the phone call, or the second slash, now across her newest painting. She told him she needed space to finish a project in another part of the city. He kissed her forehead, told her to take her time, promised he'd be waiting. That night, she packed her things with shaking hands, and her heart broke as she touched her stomach, knowing there were now more than just memories growing inside her. She left the pendant he'd given her in the pocket of his coat, a quiet goodbye, and beside it, a letter. I love you, I always will, but I cannot stay, not now, not when staying could cost you everything. One day you'll understand. She left it with a friend, someone she trusted, someone who had promised to deliver it directly into Corwin's hands. But the letter never arrived. By the time she boarded a train headed far from Elmsworth, her name was already starting to fade. She became Leora somewhere between cities. The name was chosen not for beauty, but for safety. It sounded close enough to her own to respond naturally, but far enough from Ilara Dune to avoid recognition. On her third night alone, in a station cafe, she met the man who would help her build again. His name was Malcolm, a former nurse who ran a private clinic on the outskirts of a small town. He noticed her quiet. He noticed the tired look in her eyes. And he didn't ask questions. He simply offered her tea and a safe place to rest. She stayed in the guest house behind his clinic, in exchange for organizing patient files and helping with daily tasks. As her belly grew, so did a different kind of strength, one not built on boldness, but on resolve. She was no longer just a woman running from danger. She was a mother preparing a world for the children she now carried. She sent no more letters. She called no old friends. She watched Elmsworth disappear in her mind like fog in morning light. It was safer that way. But in the silence of those years, one truth lived in her bones. She had never stopped loving Corwin. Not once, not even as she began her new life in Selbridge, not even as she gave birth to 3 souls who reminded her of him in different ways. Saren's eyes held his longing. Kyle's silence carried his storms. Mira's mind worked like his, layered, observing, always listening before speaking. She gave them her strength, and her softness, and the name they never questioned. But part of her always wondered, would he have loved them? Would he have forgiven her? She didn't know. She only knew this. Sometimes love must let go to protect itself. And even when the past is buried with care, the heart remembers where it left its roots. Selbridge never asked questions, and for that, Ilara was grateful. She arrived with little more than a suitcase and a womb full of wonder. Malcolm never pressed for answers. He gave her a room above the small bakery he inherited from his late sister and a key without condition. It was there, in that quiet space above the smell of rising dough, that she gave birth to 3 children on a cold spring morning. No doctors, just Malcolm, steady and calm, helping her through the hours with hands trained by, years of healing and a heart used to holding people without needing to fix them. Saren was born first, reaching with both hands as if the world was waiting for her touch. Kyle followed with a fierce cry that quieted only when placed on Ilara's chest. Mira arrived last, blinking in silence, her tiny face already watching the room as if she understood everything and chose to say nothing. Ilara cried the moment all 3 were resting in her arms, not because of the pain, but because somehow, even in the absence of the man she had loved, she had never felt more complete. She named them without hesitation. Each name carried a note from the life she left behind, a memory reshaped into new meaning. In Selbridge, she became someone else, but not entirely. She was still Ilara in her heart, even if no one called her that anymore. She worked odd jobs, cleaning, assisting at the local library, helping Malcolm with paperwork on weekends. The townspeople noticed her gentleness, her quiet wisdom, her way with flowers and stories. When the children were old enough to ask where their father was, she offered them the same answer every time. Some stories take time to be told. Saren never pushed. She believed in the beauty of waiting. Kyle grew restless. He searched her face when she answered, looking for cracks. Mira simply watched and stored the silence like clues in her mind. Ilara poured her love into raising them, not with extravagance, but with depth. She taught them how to think, how to listen, how to trust their instincts. She read poetry to them at night, let them sleep curled at her side during storms, and painted again. Quiet pieces, never signed. The old pendant remained hidden in her drawer. The memory of Corwin Veil remained in the corners of her solitude. She would hear his name sometimes, on the radio, in passing news segments. Veil International was expanding, merging, soaring. His face would appear in print sometimes, still handsome, still unreachable. She kept her distance, not out of fear anymore, but out of respect for what she had built. She didn't want to undo it, but there were nights when she'd watch the stars and whisper, just once, I hope you're well. The ache never left, but it grew quieter. It became something she carried, not with bitterness, but with reverence. A love that had asked her to be brave. A goodbye that had shaped everything after. Years passed. The children grew. And Ilara, now simply Leora to the world, continued on, unseen, unknown, but never unloved, until the letter arrived, the one with the gold trim, the one that bore the name she hadn't heard spoken aloud in more than 2 decades. Ilara Dune. She stared at it for hours before opening it, and when she finally broke the seal, her hands trembled, not because she was afraid, but because she knew. The story she had buried was no longer content to stay silent. The train into Elmsworth rolled in just before sunrise. Through the wide station windows, the skyline glimmered like a crown, sharp, sleek, modern. To most, it was a city of possibility. To Saren, Kyle, and Mira, it felt like approaching a ghost they'd only seen in dreams. They stepped off the platform with 1 bag each, nerves tucked beneath layered resolve. The plan was simple in theory: blend in, observe, find UNVEIL, and speak when the time felt right. Saren's fingers brushed against the locket she wore around her neck, a gift from their mother years ago. She hadn't taken it off since reading the letter. Kyle walked slightly ahead, scanning their surroundings with quiet calculation. He had already memorized the elevator codes for the Veil International Internship Wing. Mira walked silently between them, her expression unreadable as always, but her eyes already noticing things, like the polished tiles, reflection of a man checking his watch too often, or the way the receptionist tucked her smile the moment someone important walked by. They were here for answers, and they'd come as 3 minds prepared for one mission. Veil International's headquarters towered above them like a monument to ambition. Inside, the air was still, controlled, designed, polished marble, elevator music too faint to hum. A rotating display of Veil's global divisions on a massive digital wall: technology, energy, healthcare, innovation labs. Their mother had once walked these streets in love. Now they were walking back into her past. They signed in using carefully curated intern aliases, each one authentic, enough to pass scrutiny with just enough truth to stay grounded. Saren, Strategic Communications Kyle, Systems Optimization Mira, Creative Development and Concept Design. They were placed in separate departments, by their own request. They didn't want to be seen together too often, at least not yet. Over the first week, they began to work. Not just to observe, but to actually contribute. Saren quickly charmed the executive coordinator with her ability to synthesize ideas into presentations that sang. She listened more than she spoke, but when she did, her voice carried conviction that made department leads nod in approval. Kyle found inefficiencies in the company's internal logistics before the orientation breakfast was over. He built a prototype for an in-house resource tracking app on his 2nd day. By the end of the week, the IT director had called him a rare mind. Mira kept mostly to herself in the design lab. She listened. She sketched. She watched the way people moved through the building, how the art on the walls seemed to rotate out seasonally. She noticed that the founder's portrait, UNVEIL's, hung in every major room, but never in his own. He didn't need reminders. The company was his breath, his rhythm. What surprised them all, though, was how quickly their presence caused. Ripples, whispers started in hallways. Don't they look a little like that one in legal? Saren. Those eyes. Kyle, the systems intern, his tones just like Mr. Veil's. No one dared say it aloud. Not yet. But things were shifting. The 2nd week, Saren found herself summoned to a stakeholder prep meeting, unusual for interns. When she spoke, Corwin's chief of operations tilted her head slightly, studying her with narrowed eyes. Kyle was brought in to present a systems audit on day 10. The director introduced him as someone with a brain that cuts like a wire through fog. Mira remained quiet until day 12. That was when the creative director asked for volunteers to present fresh ideas for a dormant branding campaign. She raised her hand. Her concept, simple, elegant, emotionally intelligent, left the room still. UNVEIL heard about her within the hour. UNVEIL rarely noticed interns. He didn't have time for fleeting faces or the latest batch of talent funneled in by HR. But lately, 3 faces had begun to stay with him. Not clearly, just flashes. A tilt of the head in a glass reflection, a tone in someone's voice, the way a certain girl in strategy listened more than she spoke, her eyes soft and searching like she knew more than she ever said. He hadn't met them yet, Not formally, but they had surfaced on his internal briefings, especially the one from creative Mira Dane. Her branding proposal had reached his desk by accident. A junior executive had mistakenly looped him in on the pitch notes. He almost deleted the email, but a line near the bottom caught his eye. "We don't just design presence, we design feeling." He read it again. Then he sat back in his chair. Ilara once said that to him, in almost those exact words. It wasn't the kind of phrase found in textbooks. It was something whispered late at night in a loft filled with unfinished canvases. He forwarded the message to his executive assistant with one line. "Have her present it directly. I want to hear it." It was scheduled as an informal evening walkthrough, nothing official. No attention. Just an opportunity to hear new ideas, but it wasn't new ideas he was searching for anymore. In the days leading up to the meeting, he crossed paths with the interns more often. He noticed the boy in systems, KL, had a directness in his questions that reminded him of his own early career. The girl in strategy, Saren, spoke during a department lunch with such conviction that he nearly paused mid-step while walking past. He didn't believe in coincidences, but he also didn't believe in ghosts. Still, something about them stirred him in ways he couldn't place. Mira arrived at his office door exactly on time. She wore black slacks, a crisp gray top, and no visible makeup. Her expression was calm, unreadable. She carried no laptop, only a single notepad. Corwin stood when she entered, gesturing toward the table near the window instead of his desk. "I don't usually meet with interns," he said, "but I'm told your work is original." Mira nodded. "Thank you." He studied her for a moment. There was something in her stillness, not performance, not fear, just presence. "Go ahead," he said. She opened her notebook and began. Her presentation was quiet, confident, and carefully structured. She spoke about emotional architecture and brand language, about the way colors influence loyalty, about how people don't follow companies, they follow memory. Corwin didn't interrupt once. But his thoughts were moving faster than they had in years. Her cadence, her choice of words, even the way she moved her fingers, slightly, while speaking, just like Ilara used to when explaining a painting. He watched her, hearing echoes from another life, and as she turned to the last page of her notebook, she paused, then looked directly at him. "My mother was an artist too," she said quietly. The room stilled. Corwin blinked. Mira closed her notebook. She used to say that emotion was the only thing worth capturing, that even silence tells a story. He leaned forward slightly. "What was her name?" Mira held his gaze. "Ilara Dune." Silence. Complete. As if the building itself stopped breathing. The city outside continued, unaware. But inside that office, something shifted. Corwin stood, slowly. His hands trembled slightly at his sides, something they hadn't done in years. He didn't speak. Not yet. He was staring into a truth that had just stepped out of the past and spoken his heart's name. The words sat between them like something sacred. Ilara Dune. It wasn't just a name. It was a door. Corwin didn't move for a long time. His breath slowed. The soft hum of the air vents, once unnoticed, now sounded too loud in the stillness. He looked at Mira as if seeing her for the first time, not as an intern, not as a voice in the design wing, but as something he had once loved, shaped, and lost, without knowing he had ever held it at all. Her posture didn't shift. She let the silence speak for itself. Finally, he whispered, "Where is she?" The question wasn't sharp. It wasn't desperate. It was worn, like something he had carried for years in a quiet corner of his soul, unsure he'd ever ask aloud. Mira didn't answer right away. She let his words settle, gave them space. Then, softly, "She's safe." Corwin sat down again, slower this time. The weight of what he now knew seemed to fold his body inward. He looked down at his hands. They had once built an empire, but in this moment they looked empty. "She left," he said quietly, almost to himself. Without a word. Mira nodded. "She tried." "The letter never reached you." Corwin's eyes lifted, haunted, tired, astonished. "She was pregnant?" "Yes." He exhaled. The sound was fragile. "With all three of you?" "Yes." He pressed his palm against his chest, as if trying to steady something wild beneath the surface. Mira watched him, not with judgment, not even with pity, just with a deep, quiet empathy, the kind that doesn't need to be taught. "I see her in you," he said. Mira's lips lifted, almost into a smile. "She said you'd say that." That line cracked something open. Corwin stood again, but this time his steps were unsteady. He walked to the window and looked out at the city. Elmsworth, his empire, his fortress. He'd spent years building this world, brick by brick, board by board. And yet everything that mattered had lived outside its walls. He turned slowly, facing her again. "Does she hate me?" Mira shook her head. "She never stopped loving you." He looked down, overwhelmed. His voice caught in his throat. I didn't know she was trying to protect me. She protected all of us," Mira said gently. "But she paid a price." His jaw tightened, grief washing over him like a tide. He sank back into his chair, eyes glassed but unbroken. "Tell her I want to see her." Mira rose. "I already did." He looked up. Mira's eyes didn't flinch. "She'll be here in 2 days." Corwin didn't speak. His breath faltered. He looked out the window again, as if trying to measure the hours, the years, the distance between past and present. 2 days, he whispered. Mira turned to leave, then paused. "You built something great, Mr. Veil, but she was always your greatest beginning." And with that, she left. He remained still, and for the first time in a very long time, he didn't feel powerful. He felt human. Have you ever discovered a secret that changed everything? Share your moment in the comments below. Someone out there needs to hear it. The car slowed near the private entrance of Veil International. Ilara sat in the back seat, hands folded in her lap, gaze steady but far away. Elmsworth looked different. The buildings taller, the lines cleaner, but underneath the shine, it still breathed the same rhythm. Her heart wasn't racing. It was quiet, heavy, focused. The last time she'd walked these streets, she'd been a different woman, young, in love, and carrying a life inside her that she hadn't yet revealed. Now, she was a mother, a survivor, and she had come not as a guest, not as a memory, but as truth. Mira stood by the lobby, waiting. Ilara stepped out of the car. Their eyes met. "You're sure he's ready?" she asked. Mira nodded once. "He didn't sleep the night I told him. He's been waiting since." They entered through a side elevator. No press, no fanfare, no staff, just footsteps echoing in polished halls. When the doors opened, Corwin was already standing. He hadn't sat all morning. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't spoken more than 5 words since arriving before dawn. Now, as the elevator doors slid apart, he saw her. Not a memory, not a dream. Her. She stepped into the room, and the years collapsed in silence. No one spoke. They didn't rush to embrace. They didn't fill the space with words unworthy of the moment. Corwin took a step forward. She did the same, and for a long, suspended moment, they simply looked at each other. Lines marked both their faces now. Time had sculpted them. But behind every wrinkle, every shadow of age, something familiar waited. "You're here," he said. Her voice was barely audible. "I am." He didn't ask why she left. Not yet. And she didn't apologize. Not yet. They stood in the middle of the office like 2 pages of the same book, finally brought back together. He reached out, not for her hand, but gently toward her shoulder. She allowed it. His fingers rested there, trembling slightly. "Are you safe now?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "We all are." He looked down, breath caught in his chest. "I looked for you," he whispered. "I know. You were pregnant." "I know." Silence again. Not empty, just full of what had never been said. "I would have protected you," he said. "I know," she said again gently. "But you were already being hunted. If I had stayed, they would have used me to break you." He lowered his gaze. His voice cracked. "I built everything, without knowing you were my foundation." Ilara closed her eyes, just for a moment. That sentence held her together more than he could have known. They sat near the wide windows that overlooked the city. No boardroom lights, no staff in suits. Just 2 chairs, 2 people, and a lifetime between them. Corwin poured water into a glass for her with the care of someone who once feared he'd never see her again. Ilara accepted it. Their hands brushed. The touch was brief, but it left something behind. She took a sip before speaking. "Do you ever think about what would have happened? If the letter had reached you. He nodded. Every day. I left it with someone I trusted, she said. They swore they'd give it to you. His expression didn't shift, but something in his eyes dimmed. I never received it. She exhaled. I hoped you had. For years I waited for you to come, but when you didn't, I thought maybe you moved on. That maybe you were told I'd abandoned you. Corwin looked at her, slowly. I never moved on. Her lips parted slightly. No tears, but her throat tightened. I watched you from far away sometimes, on news channels, magazine covers. I told myself I should be proud, but it hurt more than I expected. He lowered his gaze. I thought I had to forget you to survive. I didn't know forgetting would feel like erasing myself. They sat quietly for a while after that, letting the room breathe, letting their pain settle like dust on old furniture, no longer a storm, just something to wipe away carefully. Then Alara asked the question that had waited too long. Do you want to meet them? Corwin's hands froze around the armrest of his chair. He looked up. They know who I am. They know everything. He didn't speak right away. He nodded once, slowly. Yes, I want to meet them. Alara rose and walked to the door. She opened it gently. A few moments later, the triplets stepped in, one by one. First Saren, calm and radiant in her posture, her gaze soft but unwavering. Then Kyle, arms at his sides, jaw tight, eyes guarded but present. And finally Mira, standing still, gaze steady, the quiet undercurrent between them all. Corwin rose to his feet. He took one breath. I don't know what to say, he confessed. Saren smiled first. You don't have to say anything yet. Kyle gave a subtle nod, still studying him. Mira said nothing, but she walked forward and handed him a folded slip of paper. She saved this for you. He opened it slowly. It was a sketch of him, drawn in soft lines, head turned, mid-laugh. Beneath it, a note in her handwriting. You never saw yourself the way I did. Corwin's hand shook as he held it. You drew this? He asked, his voice unsteady. Mira nodded. She described you to us so clearly. I wanted to see you the way she remembered. He looked at all three of them. Slowly. You look like her. But you sound like me. Saren chuckled softly. That's been said. He stepped forward, inch by inch, then paused. I missed all your firsts, your childhood, your stories. Kyle spoke, his voice low but even. That's true. But, Saren added gently, we're here now. Corwin's voice caught. If you'll let me, I'd like to start from here. Mira looked to her siblings, then back to him. Start here, she said, but mean it. He nodded, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Not absolution, not repair, but recognition. Later that afternoon, the five of them walked through a quiet courtyard behind the building, an old space Corwin had kept untouched through all the years of expansion. Alara remembered it. So did he. It had once been a simple stone garden with benches and fig trees tucked between wings of the original Veil structure. They used to meet there in the early days, just to sit in the quiet, hidden from the noise. It's still here, Alara said, brushing her fingers along the leaves of one low branch. Corwin looked at her. I never let them tear it down. Saren sat beneath a tree, sketching in her notebook. Kyle walked the perimeter with quiet steps, as if trying to understand the weight of what was built here. Mira stood beside her father, her eyes on the wall where vines had overgrown the stone. Did you know, Corwin said quietly, this is where I first told her I wanted to build something big. Alara smiled faintly. And I told you the world didn't need another empire. You were right, he said. What I needed was a family. She turned toward him. You have one now. He looked over at the three of them. Mira watching the vines. Kyle inspecting the architecture. Saren sketching quietly. They weren't just his children. They were parts of him he hadn't known were missing. I thought love had a deadline, he said. That if too much time passed, it couldn't find its way back. Alara shook her head gently. Love doesn't expire. It waits, sometimes quietly, sometimes painfully. But it waits. There was no tension in her voice, no bitterness, just clarity. They walked slowly along the stone path. I kept the pendant, he said, after a pause. She glanced at him. I hoped you would. It stayed in a box on my desk. through mergers, meetings, everything. Did you ever open it? Every morning, he said. She didn't cry, but something in her chest softened. They sat on the same bench they once shared years ago. The wind moved through the branches like breath. This isn't the end of our story, he said. Is it? Ilara reached for his hand. No, but it's not the beginning either. It's the part where the silence ends. Mira turned, watching them quietly from a distance. She saw something in her parents' posture that made her heart settle. Not reunion. Return. Saren joined them soon after, handing the sketchbook to her mother. On the page was a drawing of them, Ilara and Corwin, older now, but still aligned. Their faces worn, but peaceful. Hands touching. Underneath, she'd written, "Some love doesn't need to be loud to last. It just needs to be true." Corwin read the words and closed his eyes for a moment. Then whispered, "Thank you for coming back." Ilara smiled. "I never really left. I just waited where the world was quieter." And together, with their children nearby, they watched the afternoon light move through the leaves. There was no need for more words. The past had been acknowledged. The present had been claimed. And the future, whatever it held, would no longer be lived apart. The headline dropped on a Thursday morning. UNVEIL, secret family revealed. Triplets from vanished love now inside the company. By noon, it was everywhere. Screens buzzed in elevators. Stock forums lit up. Editorials speculated on everything from corporate betrayal to personal scandal. Commentators questioned timelines. Investors questioned leadership. Enemies resurfaced. The empire felt like it was tilting. Inside Veil International, the reaction was instant. Phones rang non-stop. Board members demanded emergency sessions. The PR department scrambled to draft statements. Security heightened access to the executive floor. And UNVEIL? He read the headline once, closed his tablet, then stood and buttoned his jacket. "Clear my afternoon," he told his assistant. "Schedule a press briefing and gather the board." He didn't flinch, not because he didn't feel the weight, but because for once he knew the truth was worth carrying. When the cameras turned on, he didn't deliver a polished speech. He didn't apologize for loving someone in secret. He didn't hide the years lost. He simply said, "The world is often built on image, but image fades. What matters is what holds when the lights go out. These are my children. This is their mother. And everything I've built means nothing if I can't share it with them." There were no scripted lines. Just a man reclaiming the pieces of his own life. The public didn't know how to react. Some applauded his honesty. Others smelled weakness. Stock prices dipped. Interviews were declined. Legal advisors urged caution. Behind closed doors, the boardroom boiled. In an emergency session, Corwin stood at the head of the table, surrounded by the most powerful voices in the company. "I'll make this brief," he said. He introduced Saren as lead strategist for brand evolution, Mira as director of creative insight and development, Kyle as head of systems innovation. "I've watched them work," he said, not just as a father, but as the CEO. "They didn't ask for this. They earned it." One board member scoffed. "They haven't been here long enough to warrant those titles." Corwin turned to him. "Neither had I when I was given my first shot." The tension in the room thickened. Another voice, a longtime board ally, cleared his throat. "Corwin, there's a line between leadership and legacy. Naming them now, it feels emotional, not strategic." He smiled faintly. "You're wrong. It's both." And just like that, the cracks began to show. Behind the measured objections were deeper fears, threatened influence, shaken control. Two members excused themselves mid-meeting. One returned. The other did not. Corwin knew what that meant. He didn't chase them. He turned back to the group. "This company will not be led by fear. Not anymore." 3 days after the public reveal, a key infrastructure file vanished from the company's digital archive. It wasn't just any file. It was a proprietary prototype under development for a massive international rollout. Years of research, billions in potential value, gone. At first, it was assumed to be a systems glitch, until Kyle reviewed the logs. This wasn't a system error, he told Mira and Saren, eyes locked on the screen. This was removed manually. From inside, Saren's voice dropped. "Sabotage?" Kyle didn't answer. Mira leaned closer. "You can trace it, can't you?" "I already am." Within the hour, he pinpointed the breach to a restricted access login, one assigned to a former board member who had left quietly after Corwin announced the triplets' appointments. The timing wasn't coincidence. Someone wanted the public fallout to grow louder. They wanted the empire to shake hard enough to break. Saren stood. We need to move. If this leak spreads, it's not just about data, it's about credibility. Kyle tapped in override codes while Mira reached out to the creative division, issuing a temporary lock on all shared concept platforms. Saren contacted legal. They moved not like interns, but like leaders. Corwin was in a global investor call when he received the alert. His assistant interrupted the meeting, something she hadn't done in over 5 years. They've contained it, she said. Your children. They acted before security could. Corwin excused himself from the call. By the time he reached the innovation wing, the crisis was under control. The files were recovered. Legal notices were prepared. Public exposure was avoided. Kyle stood by the server room door, arms crossed. Saren was still on a call, finalizing a statement for internal distribution. Mira sat quietly with the team in the design suite, restoring visual drafts that had been wiped. Corwin didn't speak. He just watched. This was his legacy, not just a company that weathered storms, but a family that stood together when tested. Later that evening, they gathered in his office. I heard what you did, Corwin said, his voice low. You didn't panic. You didn't point fingers. You moved. Kyle shrugged. Wasn't going to let someone tear this place apart before we even started. Saren added, We're not here just to carry your name. Mira looked at him. We're here to build something with it. He sat back slowly, absorbing every word. I built this empire to be unshakable, he said. But I see now. I was building it alone. Ilara stepped into the room then, unnoticed at first. She had been standing just outside. You never had to be alone, she said softly. He looked at her. Then at the triplets. Not anymore. There was a quiet after that. Not heavy. Not sad. Just whole. As if something that had been broken for too long had finally settled into place. In the weeks that followed, the tone of the company began to change. Departments that once operated in silos began holding joint strategy circles, Saren's idea. The innovation wing launched new open-source models, Kyle's blueprint. The branding shifted to a warmer tone, guided by Mira's vision. We are more than what we make. We are who we protect. Shareholders who had threatened to pull out stayed, and employees began speaking about the triplets with something rare. Respect earned, not demanded. In private, Corwin made arrangements to restructure the board. One seat remained permanently reserved for a voice that had once disappeared to save them all. Ilara Dune, not as an executive, but as the heart behind everything they were becoming. And as for the triplets, Saren, Kyle, and Mira, they never claimed the spotlight. They worked. They listened. They learned. They didn't need the world to approve of them. They had already faced its storm and stood together. Elmsworth was different at night, not louder, not busier, just softer. Ilara walked beside Corwin in the old district, where the sidewalks curved gently and the lights overhead blinked with quiet rhythm. They didn't speak much, and they didn't need to. Their footsteps fell into the same pace without trying. It was their third walk that week. They hadn't called them dates. They hadn't called them anything, but something was being rebuilt, slowly, deliberately, not on nostalgia, but on presence. At one point, Corwin stopped. Across the street stood a bookstore, the same one where Ilara used to browse for second-hand poetry collections and dog-eared biographies of forgotten artists. It was still open. Do you want to? He asked. She smiled. Of course. Inside, the scent of old paper and lavender oil filled the narrow aisles. Not much had changed. The same wooden ladder leaned against the back shelf. The owner, now gray-haired and slower in her steps, nodded politely as they entered. Ilara ran her fingers over the spines. Corwin watched her. You always touched books like they were breathing, he said. She looked over her shoulder. And you always remembered what no one else noticed. They moved aisle by aisle. No rush, no awkwardness, just the rhythm of rediscovery. He handed her a copy of a journal she used to carry. She laughed gently, still observant. You were always easy to admire. Later that evening, they sat by the fireplace in Corwin's penthouse. Not facing the city, not surrounded by grandeur, just sitting close, Small tray of tea between them, the fire giving the room its only glow. Ilara found an old box tucked beneath one of his shelves. Inside were folded letters, unfinished drafts. Some were only a line or two. Others had full paragraphs crossed out in frustration. "You kept them," she said softly. "I wrote to you," he replied, "but I didn't know where to send the words." She unfolded one and read it aloud. "I don't know how to let go of someone I built my world around." She looked up at him. His voice was calm. "I couldn't move forward, so I built upward. But it never felt steady." Ilara reached across and placed her hand on his. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. "You're steadier than you think," she said. "You just needed the truth beneath your feet." They sat there for a long time, firelight flickering across their faces. Nothing rushed, nothing forced. Love, waiting its turn. They returned to the gallery on a Sunday morning when the city was still wiping sleep from its windows, and the sky held that early hue between rose and pale gold. It wasn't the same gallery where they'd first met. Too many years had passed, and that one had closed long ago. But this space felt familiar. It was small, dimly lit. Honest, Ilara moved through the rooms quietly, pausing in front of an abstract piece that reminded her of a memory she couldn't quite name. Corwin stayed a few steps behind, watching more than wandering. She still tilted her head when something moved her, still crossed her arms when she was thinking deeply. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed watching her exist. "You never went back to painting?" he asked gently. "I tried," she said, "but the grief changed my hands. I started again after the children were born. Nothing for show, just small pieces, quiet things." He nodded. "I'd like to see them one day." "You will." They stopped in front of a piece painted in grayscale, a woman reaching for something just out of frame. Ilara stared at it a little longer than the others. "She looks like someone who almost let herself disappear," she said. Corwin didn't respond with words. He reached out, lacing his fingers through hers, and she let him. That evening, they sat together on the rooftop garden of Corwin's building. It wasn't extravagant, just a handful of plants, a small table, and a pair of chairs facing the skyline. There was tea again. Always tea. Ilara held her cup with both hands. "You know," she said, "there was a time when I thought I'd never be able to sit with you like this again. Not without bitterness, not without guilt." He looked at her, steady. "And now?" "Now," she whispered, "I feel safe." He exhaled softly, almost in relief. They sat in silence for a while, wrapped in the calm that comes only after storms. Then Corwin said it, not as a proposal, not as a performance, but as a thought spoken gently into the night. "If we ever decided to try again, to make something permanent, I wouldn't want it to be grand, just honest." Ilara looked at him. Her smile came slowly, like light rising over water. "If we ever do," she said, "let it be on a Tuesday, in a garden, with no one but the children watching. No vows, just truth. No rings." She reached for his hand. "You're already wearing the years I missed. I don't need more." He held her hand longer this time, and they stayed like that. Two people who had broken, rebuilt, and now sat in the middle of something they hadn't planned. Peace. The ballroom at the Vail International Grand Hall was filled with silver light and quiet anticipation. It wasn't just a celebration, it was history. 50 years since the company's founding. A timeline etched into innovation, resilience, and influence. But tonight, the room wasn't buzzing with stock forecasts or acquisition rumors. It was waiting for Corwin Vail to speak. The man who had built the company from vision and sweat. The man who had once ruled through silence. The man who now stood at the podium with a softer edge in his eyes. He looked out at the room, at the executives in tailored suits, at the staff who had climbed with him, at the media poised with lenses and pens, and at the front row, where Ilara sat beside Saren, Kael, and Mira. He adjusted the microphone once, then paused. 50 years, he began. Half a century of building, half a century of decisions, risks, sacrifices. He glanced at the room. Not rushed, not reading, just speaking. "When I first started this company, I thought success meant being untouchable, that if I stayed focused, if I shut out the noise, I'd make something unbreakable." He let the weight of that thought sit for a moment. "And I did build something, but for a long time I didn't realize I was building with a missing piece." Murmurs stirred in the back of the room. Cameras steadied. "Years ago, I lost someone I loved. She disappeared, and I believed I'd been left behind. He turned slightly toward the front row, toward Ilara. But she wasn't gone. She was surviving. And in her courage, she brought 3 lives into the world that would eventually show me what real legacy means. Now the room was silent. This company has always been driven by results. But results alone don't build a future. People do. Heart does. He looked out again. Today I stand before you not just as the founder of UNVEIL International, but as a father, as a man who learned that power without love is shallow, that forgiveness is not weakness, but wisdom, that the past doesn't have to define the end. Sometimes it becomes the beginning. He gestured toward Siren. She brought strategy where we needed soul. Then Kael. He saw systems where we saw routine. Then Mira. And she reminded us that creativity is not decoration, it's vision. Corwin steadied his breath. They didn't ask for the spotlight, they came for the truth. And now, I stand beside them, not because they carry my name, but because they carry something far greater. He stepped away from the microphone, the applause rising slowly, then all. At once, genuine, rising, no longer out of obligation but recognition. He nodded once, then returned to his seat beside Ilara. She reached for his hand. No words, just pride. The weeks after the anniversary didn't bring confetti or headlines. They brought something far more valuable. Clarity. UNVEIL International began to breathe differently. Not slower, not louder, just with intention. Siren walked through the East Wing one morning, notebook in hand, stopping, to sit with a junior strategist no one had noticed in months. She listened, asked 2 questions, and rewrote a campaign in a single afternoon that later doubled outreach. She didn't demand attention. She earned trust. Kyle sat behind glowing panels of code late into the night, not because he had something to prove, but because he finally had somewhere to build without silence. His system overhaul saved the company 12% in internal costs within 1 quarter. He didn't make a speech about it. He just fixed what was broken. Mira began hosting morning walks with the creative team. No formal meetings, no presentations, just conversation, coffee, and color. Her latest campaign tagline? Let people feel something. Or nothing we do matters. Even the board, once wary, began to adapt. Resistance softened. Tradition opened its grip. The change was not loud. It was steady. And Corwin Veil? He was often seen without a tie now, sometimes walking the halls alone, sometimes pausing beside the very interns he once ignored. He spoke less, but when he did, people leaned in. And Ilara? She didn't claim a title, but her influence was in the stillness, tea in the courtyard with employees, laughter. In the break rooms, quiet encouragement, in the background of decisions. She and Corwin didn't move fast, they just moved forward. There were no announcements, but one morning, in the garden behind the office, she placed her hand in his and said, softly, "We never needed a ceremony, we just needed this." And he nodded, smiling without a word. Sometimes what we lose doesn't disappear. It waits. For timing, for truth, for a path back home. Legacy isn't about what we leave behind in buildings or numbers. It's about the moments we choose to show up with love, even after being broken. Forgiveness is a form of courage. And second chances? They are the quiet miracles that rewrite everything. So wherever you are in your journey, don't be afraid to begin again. You've just walked through a story of love that never gave up, of truth buried deep, and the strength it takes to bring it back into the light. Ilara chose safety, but she never stopped loving. Corwin chose legacy, but never stopped hoping. And 3 children, raised in quiet strength, became the bridge that brought it all home. This wasn't a story about power. It was about what we do when we lose it, and who we become when we find our way again. Maybe you've lost something, or someone. Maybe you've buried your own truth, thinking time would silence it. But time doesn't erase love. It waits for the right hands to carry it forward. Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's release. And sometimes, second chances show up when we least expect them, wrapped in silence, carried by the brave and welcomed by the heart that still remembers. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of someone you once knew, or someone you're becoming, like this video, share it with someone who needs a little hope. Drop a comment. Let us know what moment stayed with you. And if you want more stories that speak to the heart, subscribe. This trail doesn't end here. Thank you for watching Mr. Ross' story trail. Until next time, hold on to what matters. Let go of what doesn't. And above all, don't be afraid to begin again.